It's my great pleasure to kick off School is a Factory by introducing Grant, who among other things is the co-curator of Bauhaus Imaginista, a very ambitious project commemorating the founding of the Bauhaus School 100 years ago in 1919 that has been several years in the making and has taken form in, I think, 10 cities or more internationally, as many things as workshops, exhibitions, interventions, lectures, publications, and other projects, and which recently culminated last year at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin with an exhibition and conference. It's obviously great timing to talk about this project, and given the 100-year anniversary and, of course, this culmination I just mentioned, but we also found it really important to begin with this particular movement simply because it was referenced by so many other speakers and contributors and schools of thought that we encountered while we were putting together this program. So we thought, why not give the background that it's due. So Grant Watson joins us from London, where he's an independent curator and researcher, having formerly acted as senior curator at the Institute of International Visual Arts London, curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, and curator of visual arts at Project Dublin. His recent projects include How We Behave with If I Can't Dance in Amsterdam, which explores questions of life, practice, and politics through filmed interviews conducted in cities such as London, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, and LA. Other recent curatorial projects include the research collaborations Practice International and Tagore, Pedagogy, and Practice International and Tagore, Pedagogy and Contemporary Visual Cultures, which address questions of the transnational through art. After Grant speaks, we'll be joined on stage for a presentation by Maud Housset, who I will introduce in due time. Thanks very much. Please welcome Grant.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Fatima, for organizing this at such short notice so brilliantly. So it's really nice to be here, and it's great to present this project. In fact, our opening was a few days ago, so I'm kind of holding on to the podium because we had a very intense series of days at the opening. We had a conference, guided tours, etc., etc. But it's still very fresh in my mind. As Victoria said, Bauhaus Imaginista was a 3-year research project which was not, the commission was not to look at the school while it was active between 1919 and 1933, but instead to think about the international legacy of the Bauhaus. So what happened to Bauhaus ideas as they circulated in different parts of the world in the subsequent 100 years. Now, of course, that kind of brief is sort of unmanageable. It's too big to really take hold of, and the danger is that you end up with something a kind of vague cosmopolitanism. So what we did when we conceptualized the project, myself and the co-curator Marion van Osten, who unfortunately can't be here today, is we tried to organize the exhibition in a way that would provide focus. And the device we used for that was to take 4 Bauhaus objects, or as they say in German, Gegenstände, and to use them, we can, suddenly this is, there we go. Yeah, so to use these 4 Bauhaus objects to develop 4 conceptual and thematic chapters. The objects that we chose were mostly propositional objects. So the manifesto was the first object, and its proposition is a new school which was to open in Weimar in 1919. And we used this object to develop a chapter which looks at questions of pedagogy. But what was very important for us, I think, also as a kind of ethos of the project, was not to always centralize the Bauhaus and make it the kind of originator of all of the ideas about avant-garde pedagogy in the early 20th century. I mean, the Bauhaus itself arose out of a whole stream of concepts around research pedagogy which were circulating in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It also drew on international currents of thought as well. And so in this exhibition chapter, we look at three schools. One is the school that was established the same year as the Bauhaus in 1919 by Rabindranath Tagore at Shantiniketan in West Bengal, what is now West Bengal. And the other school was a small project that ran for 10 years that was set up by a Japanese architect called Renshichiro Kawakita, called the School of New Design and Architecture, which was short-lived but extremely influential in terms of propagating ideas about modern design in Japan. The second chapter starts from a drawing by Paul Clay called Tepish, and it's a drawing of a North African carpet. And we use this drawing to develop a chapter that looks at questions of cultural appropriation. So at the Bauhaus, there was actually generally with modernist artists and designers of that time, an interest to break away from European classicism, and one of the ways they attempted to do that was by looking beyond the European paradigm, to look to the pre-modern, to look at the popular arts and crafts. And if you see in this image on the left-hand side, there's a series of books. And these books would have been in the Bauhaus library right from the very start, from 1919, from the Weimar period. And these books are a collection of books of images from ethnographic museums in Germany of that time. And they include information and images on ancient Mexican architecture, Peruvian weaving, for example, African sculpture, as well as European folk traditions. And in this chapter, what we tried to sort of hold as a concept is the idea of ambivalence. So when we talk about cultural appropriation, often it's seen as a sort of critical charge, and we're not sort of wagging our fingers at the Bauhausers and saying, bad Bauhausers, you were stealing information from elsewhere. We're saying there was something to it. There was an attempt to, in a way, look beyond Europe, but at the same time there was a decontextualizing of that material, and there was also a sort of turning of a blind eye or a complete lack of knowledge of how those objects came to be in European museums and hence into the orbit of the Bauhaus. The third chapter starts from a collage by Marcel Breuer, which is called Ein Bauhaus Film 5 Years Long. And this was published in the first Bauhaus magazine in 1926. And it's a film, as you can see, it's a film strip, and it depicts each frame is a chair designed by Breuer. Some of them are designed in collaboration with Günter Sturzel, the first two. And what you can read from this image is that actually there was a very rapid change of styles at the Bauhaus. So when we think about the notion of a Bauhaus style, this is essentially a construct which was later projected onto the school. The school was incredibly heterogeneous. So even within this very short period of 1921 to 1925, you can see kind of the move from an expressionist aesthetic through to a Die Stil aesthetic, through to the very famous tubular steel chair by Breuer from 1925. And then what Breuer does is he projects into an unknown future with the woman sitting on air. So, he's saying, what will design become in the future? And in this chapter, what we do is we look at a whole series of examples of the way that Bauhaus ideas have traveled to other cultures and geographies, including the Soviet Union, India, North Korea, China, and the United States, and how they, in that process of travel, they kind of interact also with ideology. They become transformed, and they service other kinds of needs. The fourth chapter is based on this work, which is by Kurt Schwertfeger. It wasn't really a work. It was more like an experiment that was made at a Bauhaus party. So, as you probably know, partying was a very important aspect of the Bauhaus. Gropius mentions this in the very beginning, that there would be kind of these social moments at which staff and students would come together in a convivial space. And this was actually an apparatus using wooden panels and colored lights, and it produced a kind of geometric pattern on the wall. And it was operated at at a party, and it was operated in Kandinsky's apartment at the Lantern Party. And in this chapter, what we do is we look at art school experimentation, which is without a function. So it's a kind of a surplus of the art school. And we look at what kind of applications they then go on to take. And they include in this chapter, for example, at MIT, you have Kepes, Georgi Kepes, who was a very strong associate of Moholy-Nagy, developing ideas which go on to be used in the military-industrial complex. On the other hand, you have ideas coming out of art schools and finding their way into popular culture through electronic music. So it's a kind of eclectic investigation into these diverse forms that the creativity and experimentation with light and sound take from the art school into kind of different types of social spaces. But the subject of this discussion is pedagogy. And one of the things that we did in 2017, once we'd established these 4 chapters and these 4 thematics, was we went on we broke the 4 chapters down into historical case studies, and we developed these case studies with a team of researchers from different parts of the world, one of whom is here today, Mortuses, who will talk about her research on the School of Art and Design in Casablanca. But we developed our research in different parts of the world, and we were very much reliant on the knowledge and the generosity of researchers from there. And then in 2018, we, as Victoria said, we made exhibitions and discursive events in the places where the research had happened. And that was very important for us in terms of somehow testing out that research in those particular contexts. And also bringing something to those spaces. So the Bauhaus Imaginista project wouldn't happen entirely in Germany. This was a kind of, in a way, an important ethic for the project. And I'll just quickly run through the spaces that we collaborated with. All of the information can be found in our online journal. So if you want more information, please go there. But we worked with the Cube in Rabat, with the China Design Museum in Hangzhou. We made a workshop with various museums in New York. And then we had an exhibition in Kyoto at the National Gallery of Modern Art. We had an exhibition and symposium in the Garage in Moscow, and the same in Sesc Pompeii in Sao Paulo. And then we had 2 discursive events which happened almost simultaneously, one in Lagos and one in Delhi. And we also had an exhibition at the Kiran Naidu Museum in New Delhi. And one of the things that came out of this research, which was not unexpected, but somehow surprising in a way in terms of how widespread it was this interest in different parts of the world in Bauhaus pedagogy and Bauhaus teaching practices, and the many institutions which had looked to the Bauhaus in order to try and formulate their curriculum. And the exhibition includes examples, larger, smaller scale presentations of these schools. So the Bauhaus, as I said, it came out of many different, there were parallel activities happening in schools in Germany. So, for example, there was already a preliminary course, which was in another school than the Bauhaus. The idea of workshop training, the idea of synthesizing arts and crafts, these weren't utterly unique to the Bauhaus. But the Bauhaus did bring these things together in a very exceptional way. The manifesto itself is quite a unique set of documents. It includes, probably some of you have read the manifesto, it includes a sort of utopic call for the synthesis of the arts and crafts in a way in the service of social reconstruction. So this was directly after the First World War, and there was a need to rebuild society in a completely different and better way. There is a print by Feininger of a cathedral on the manifesto, and this represents another stream of influence for the Bauhaus, which was partly coming from the arts and crafts movements, which look back to the medieval Masonic lodges and craft guilds, and to the idea of the collective production of craft and design. But then the manifesto is accompanied by a work program which is extremely detailed. It's a sort of account of the disciplines, the kinds of materials that would be used, even the fee-paying structure and the kind of gender balance of the students is included in that work program. And this was also something which was quite exceptional about the Bauhaus, which was its ability to bring together ambition, vision, both aesthetic and social, along with a kind of practical and concrete application. So the curriculum that was devised from Gropius's scheme, from his impetus, included, importantly, a preliminary course. So Bauhaus students were invited, or actually it was mandatory, it wasn't an invitation, it was a mandatory part of their studies, that they would start by spending a year doing a preparatory course which was experimenting with form, color, materials, sound, touch, highly experimental. If they passed that course, they would then go on to enter the workshops. And that was another very important tenet of the Bauhaus pedagogy, was workshop training. So basically training through doing. The Bauhaus came out of an anti-academic movement, and there was a belief that you would learn actually through making things, and making things also in collaboration with industry. So increasingly the Bauhaus starts to enter into collaboration with German companies, and later in the late 20s becomes quite successful in that respect. Another very important aspect of the Bauhaus, which I think many of you know, is the presence of a set of leading, eminent artists of the period, including Kandinsky and Klee, Feininger and others. And the idea that Gropius had, and it wasn't just his idea, it was an idea which also was circulating quite widely, was that the kind of that the fine arts could sort of be somehow embedded within a design teaching practice. So that's quite a brief little description of the pedagogy. If any of you are interested in following it up, there's a book by Rainer K. Wick called Teaching at the Bauhaus, which is an authoritative study. It goes into great detail about all the different teaching practices. And what he says about the teaching practice is that it's very difficult to think about it in terms of either as a kind of unitary phenomenon, or as something which you can just take and transpose to another time and place. So this becomes a question, actually. This became a part of our research in a way, was how were these ideas from the curriculum, how were they transposed, how were they adapted and changed? He says on the one hand, you had the political, economic circumstances of the Bauhaus, which even in its short lifespan, which changed quite dramatically. And then you had a kind of heterogeneous set of teaching practices extending from these different tutors, artist tutors who had very strong positions. So they ranged from the mystical approach of someone like Itten to the co-op principle-inspired work of Hannes Meyer to Mies van der Rohe at the end, who attempted to depoliticize the school. And in between all of that, there were huge conflicts and arguments and expulsions. So there's no one single Bauhaus that can be sort of somehow taken and taken up. Nevertheless, in the book, it's quite interesting. Wick goes on to say that almost immediately, Bauhaus influence was felt in schools because graduates were looking for jobs. They left the Bauhaus and they went to other German schools, and they were sort of reiterating some Bauhaus ideas. And then most importantly, in the post-war period, you had the School of Design at Ulm, HFG Ulm, that at a certain moment there was discussion of it being called the New Bauhaus. But that school, which took up a lot of Bauhaus ideas, and its first director was Max Bill, who was Bauhaus-trained Swiss architect. And it included teachers such as Joseph Albers, Helena Nonna Schmidt, and Walter Peter Hans, were teaching as faculty at the school. It very quickly ran into trouble and debate, and there was argument amongst the staff about how relevant the Bauhaus was actually in the post-war period. And in particular, Otto Eicher wrote a polemic where he says that the problem with the Bauhaus is on the one hand, it had this very concrete approach to art and to design and education. On the other, it had these kind of universal notions of the square, the triangle, the circle, and so forth. And what he particularly didn't like was the way that the artists became, as he described it, princes at the Bauhaus. So they were considered the kind of venerated figures. And he wanted to really develop design as a more autonomous discipline. And he wanted to get rid of fine art from the Ulm school. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll just really quickly go through some of the schools that we discuss that we show in our exhibition, and then maybe quickly go through some slides. So, of course, the most well-known transition of the Bauhaus was to the United States, and we do cover that in the show briefly with Gropius at Harvard, Joseph and Annie Albers at Black Mountain College, Joseph Albers at Yale, Moholy Nagy at the New Bauhaus in Chicago. And then we have some sort of lesser-known figures such as Trude German-Prey, who was a very important teacher in California, as was Marguerite Wildenhain, the potter. More surprising, perhaps, is the initiative by the Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi in the 1950s. Bobardi was Italian. She moved to Brazil in 1946. And her husband, Pietro Bardi, became the director of the Museum of Art in São Paulo. And part of their mission was to sort of bring European design to Brazil. And part of her way of doing that, beyond exhibitions, was to set up an industrial design school. And there she referenced the Bauhaus. And in fact, Pietro Bobardi wrote to Black Mountain College saying, can you please send us information about your curriculum? And Rushdie, who was an architect, went to Chicago and made a study of the school. But what was also interesting about that was that later, Bobardi goes to Bahia, and she becomes director of the museum in Salvador. And there she actually shifts her attention to the production of popular craft in the northeast of Brazil. And the impetus for that was very much to try and make a sort of break from the European modernist tradition and say, actually, if modernism is to be made in Brazil, it has to be a Brazilian form of modernism. And that, I think, goes back to this question of, where and how does Bauhaus land? I'll just finish by mentioning the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. This was another school that we looked at, which was set up. It was established in 1961, and it was an initiative of the Indian government. And what they did initially was they contacted through, I think, the Sarabhai family, Charles and Ray Eames, who came to India and made a study of design in India, and then produced a report called the Indian Report, which is in the exhibition. But even though at the beginning you had this sort of interest in American design, ultimately what happened was there was much more interest amongst the faculty at NID in the Ulm model. And our researcher, Suchitra Balasubramaniam, who studied at NID in the 1980s and worked with us on putting together this display here, which is about NID, said that she was astonished when she visited the Bauhaus archive in Berlin to see the exercises, see the four-course exercises, which were very similar to the ones that she had done herself when she was a student at NID. But then she went on to say that in 1975 there was a reformulation of the preliminary course at NID, an attempt to orient it away from the Ulm model and towards what was believed to be more relevant for an Indian consumer. And they introduced things like environmental research, placements with artisans in villages, and actually more towards a more development model, which represented a departure in a way from the Bauhaus Ulm model, which we're talking about. So now I'll hand over to Maud, who will go into much more detail about one of the case studies, and then maybe we can discuss the question in more detail on the couch.